starting the preaching class. And so this is a class to help our preachers here get better. And it will also be a course that could then be added to the Sovereign Way School of Theology a little later. And so pretty much my plan is to take maybe 6 weeks to go through really the science and art of preaching. So the first few weeks we'll be dealing with the science. The second few weeks we'll be dealing with the art. But the bottom line is, by the end, what I'm hoping is that everybody will know how to study for a sermon, how to construct a good sermon, and then the tips for how to deliver a good sermon. So that's where we're going with this. I definitely want to make sure that that this is a workshop, not just a situation where I'm dumping information on you, but I asked you guys to come with a text, right? And you don't have to talk about your text today, but next time, if each person could say a little bit about their text, that'll be awesome, and I'll give you, the guidelines at the end of this lesson. But I have a microphone going around, and so, Thomas, would you tell me what your text is, just so I have it in mind, the text that you'll be studying?
Yes, it'll be Luke 14, 25 to 34.
Okay, so Luke 14, 25 to 34. David, how about yourself?
So, unfortunately, I haven't, I don't know the verse offhand, but I know I want to be in 1 John about just, if you love me, you'll love one another by showing that you have. And so it's basically on the topic of gathering together and not denying that, which also is covered in other texts.
Perfect.
So.
Yeah, that would likely be John 3 maybe.
Yeah.
But John repeats some of the same themes over and over again. So, good. And then, of course, we got a couple people showing up late. I could ask them a little later. But pretty much just keep everything that I'm teaching in mind with that text. Because the idea is, when we're done with this six lessons from now, you're going to have that sermon done. And then it's going to be a good sermon, well crafted, and then that becomes the template for all your future sermons. A lot of times I could give you the information, but then you forget it, and then when you're home, you write the sermon the way you always have. Whereas this way, it's like we're doing it together in steps, and then henceforth you're like, oh, I remember what I did, and then you're just able for future sermons to, follow the same process. So, that being said, today we're going to be talking about the text itself and exegesis, okay? Simple subject, but this is probably the more dry part of it. This doesn't tell you how to engage a crowd or anything like that, but it does tell you how to study the text, okay? Now, there are 2 errors that are typical when it comes to preaching, and I'm going to take these from Dr. Herschel York. He was one of my professors at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And so I'll read it directly from his book. The first error 1, he says, on the one hand, we may preach factoid sermons. We become modern Matthew Henrys in miniature, faithfully attempting verse-by-verse exposition, thoroughly exegeting the text, smugly explaining how many gallons are in a firkin and how many furlongs are in a mile, and the relative value of a drachma in U.S. dollars. We clarify the concept of a bondslave and the laws of levirate marriage, and convince ourselves that merely explaining the text to a modern audience is the same thing as showing its relevance for a modern audience. In other words, data dump. Some people are like, well, I'm going to show you what I know. So a talent is, no, you don't necessarily want to do that, because then the people walk away like, how is this relevant? Now, I don't want to disparage that study. You need to know that stuff. And some of it you have to find a way to explain. Okay, but but that's not the point of the sermon. Okay? Now, and again, he says here, make no mistake about it, our sermons should clearly explain the meaning of the text, and when appropriate, the preacher ought to explain how much a drachma is worth, or the identity of the 144,000. He shouldn't just, but his point is, you shouldn't just stop there and think you preached. Now, what's error number 2? Error number 2 is, he says, if one great failure of preaching is giving content without application, the other great blunder of preaching is being only emotional in our presentation, making an emotional connection that's devoid of biblical truth. This kind of preaching often allows the listener to draw his or her own conclusions. Under such preaching, people may be moved, but seldom are they changed. When preachers mistake emotion for the work of the Spirit, they undermine the authority intent of Scripture. And as essential as emotion is in the task of preaching, one one dare not divorce it from biblical content and sound application. A preacher could dramatically relate the story of the crucifixion, for example, but if he only makes people sorry that Jesus suffered so horribly, he may well be talking about a dog getting hit by a car on a busy highway. It's not merely the event that matters, but the meaning of that event. And I think that's well said, because people either are factoid preachers or they're just emotional preachers, getting a crowd all riled up, but for what? It's not based on the scripture. What we need to do is we need to combine the facts with the passion and show people the relevance, okay? And so I took this from a shepherd's conference years and years ago from Rick Holland. I'm pretty sure we can make a prettier version of it. We got gifted artists here, even one in this class. But no need. I think Rick Holland's, I knew when the artist looked at it, he'd be like, oh my gosh. But anyhow, actually, let me put this back up on the screen there so I could explain it. Pretty much, when it comes to preaching, the left side of this is the science, and the right side of it is the art. And so what we're going to be focusing on for the first few lessons is the left side, right? And so on the left side, first thing is your personal preparation. Are you ready to preach this text? Are you doing the spiritual disciplines? Is your walk with the Lord right? Not perfect, but is it right? Okay, and once you got that, then of course you're going to analyze the text's content, okay? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, the analysis of the text content. And then after you know that, you're going to expose the text structure. I'm hoping to get to that today as well. And then you're going to apprehend the text's intent. That'll be the next couple weeks. Once you have that all figured out, the goal is to get to the timeless truth. That's the top of the pyramid. Once you have the timeless truth, okay, once you ascend there and you know what this text is about for all times, then you're able to move to the right side, okay, of this, the art side, and this is where you isolate the sermon's intent. The sermon's intent has to be based off the timeless truth, right? It's going to mirror the text's intent, but the sermon's intent is going to be tailored for the modern audience so that they understand how it's relevant for them. Then what you want to do is organize the sermon structure, and it's interesting, the sermon structure, if you look to the left, should match the text structure. Yes, David?
So with the sermon intent or the title of the text intent, is that like what you do when you show like what the meaning of the text is and you build towards that?
I do. So when I'm studying, my goal is to figure out what is the timeless truth here. Once I have that figured out, then what I want to do is craft it into a short statement, and I'll explain those. They could be themes to be explained, they could be propositions. Each one has its own form. But then, yeah, you state that timeless text, or that timeless truth, and then you walk people through it with the text. After you organize the sermon structure, you synthesize the sermon's content. And again, it should not be radically different from the text content, okay? And then, of course, on the bottom of it, personal assimilation. How does this apply to me? How does it apply to my audience, okay? On this left side, if you look in the top corner, this consists of hermeneutics, exegesis, what the text meant, okay, when the author wrote it. Not what it means, but what it meant. On the right side, now we're moving from hermeneutics to homiletics, okay, from exegesis to exposition. Okay? Exposition is built off exegesis, but it's not the same thing. And then we're moving from what the text meant to what the text means. They're not going to be different from each other, but the way it's stated. Okay? Like example, don't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. Well, that meant what it meant. But how would we say that today? Like, what's the timeless principle for it? What does it mean for all of us, right? And of course, on the left side, it's a science. On the right side, it's an art. And then you can't really see it up here, but on the bottom, the left side where we're doing the science, it's historical, it's particular, it's in the past. Where when we're dealing with the sermon, it's contemporary, it's universal, and it's in the present. So like if you're writing a paper on what the text meant for seminary, it's going to be past tense, but when you're preaching in the present tense because you're telling people what it means, okay? And so again, hopefully that walkthrough of that made sense and helped. And so let me define really quickly what expository preaching is. And by the way, Carlos, if you have a question or comment, there's a microphone that they're passed around. You just talk into it, picks it up perfectly. Okay, so what is expository preaching? Expository preaching is any kind of preaching that shows people the meaning of a biblical text and leads them to apply it to their lives. It needs both of those, okay? So it has to explain what the text means, and show you how to apply it. If it's missing one of those, it's not preaching, okay? It's not expositional preaching, at least. Now, if we're going to meet that definition, then there's several things that need to happen, okay? First, you need to pick a biblical text. That's why I asked you guys to have one already in mind. David and Thomas already shared. Hey, Carlos, do you have a text in mind that you're going to be picking for your next sermon?
I will. It'll be Ephesians chapter 2, and I think it'll be verses, I think the latter verses. I think I preached 1 through 7, so it'll be 8 through, either 7 through 10, I believe.
Okay, nice. 7 through 10. That's quite the text, and it preaches well. So, yeah, that's a good choice. So, yeah, you got to pick a biblical text, and you need to understand the text, okay? And so understanding the text is what we're getting at right now. And then you need to find and communicate the timeless truth of the text. And that's when we get into the homiletical side. And that's where I think people struggle the most, is in their sermon construction. I think all you guys know how to study to get down to what a text means. I'm going to give you some tools to maybe refine it and get a little better at it. I don't think that's your guys' problem. Assuming there are problems, right? Where I think the hardest part is, how do I take this timeless truth and construct it in a sermon where, like, there's clear railroad tracks and the church knows where it's going. They see how the timeless truth drives the sermon. That's the stuff that I really want to get across, but you can't get there without the exegesis. And so that's why we have to hit the exegesis portions as well. And so today, we're going to focus on understanding the text, okay? When you've determined what book your text will come from, so Carlos said Ephesians, right? Then you're going to read that book again and again, because that text is not isolated. It's coming from a book. It's a broader argument from a broader purpose, okay? And once you've done that, then what you want to do is you want to determine the preachable units within the book. Now, you guys have already done that. Thomas said Luke, 14, 25 through 34. And then Carlos is saying Ephesians 2, 7 through 10. Okay, so you got the preachable units there, okay? Once you have the preachable unit, okay, so if you notice, we're moving big from the book itself to the preachable unit, and now from the preachable unit, we're moving down to the sentences. You diagram what you're about to preach, and I'm going to show you a real easy way for this. If you could do it in Greek, great. If you can't, English is fine. And so here's what diagramming looks like. And by the way, for people who are about a year or two older than me, this was taught in elementary school. Now, once I got to elementary school, they stopped teaching it. And so we're at a disadvantage. But my brothers had to do this. And so we make sure our kids had to do this. And so it's one reason both my kids are good readers. And so let me break this down real quick. So if the sentence, oh yeah, David?
No, I was just going to ask, are these slides going to be available?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I will make them available so you guys don't have to write everything down. But if there's something that it'll help you to remember, to personally write it down, then by all means, write it down. But going back to the diagram, let's assume the sentence is, going to the store yesterday, I briefly saw a big brown dog bite an old man who was passing him on a bicycle on the ankle. Okay, so there's some convolution near the end of that. So to understand what's being said, is you diagram first, what are the core components of a sentence? Subject, verb, object. The subject is I, the verb, the action word, is saw, and then the object is a dog. I saw a dog. That's ultimately what's happening here. Now, all these other words are adding information to either the subject, the verb, or the object. So the subject, I, what's being added to him? Well, I was going to the store when? Yesterday. That all modifies the I. Tells me what I was doing, when, okay? Now for the verb saw, there's only one thing modifying it, the adverb, briefly. It's telling you how long he saw. Was he seeing this happen all day? Or was he seeing this happen just for like a second? Well, it's briefly. Now, where a lot of this stuff is with the direct object, a dog. What about the dog? It was big, it was brown, it bit somebody. Now we got to modify who it bit, because here's another verb. Who's the object of that verb? An old man. It would suck. I mean, rather be a young guy who could take it, but of course the old man, he can't run, so he's like, grrr, so he bites an old man. What about the old man? He was passing him on a bicycle. Now, where did the dog do the bite? He attacked the ankle. Okay, so all that takes that sentence, it breaks it down, and what makes this easy for you guys to remember is just there's only 3 columns: subject, verb, object. Now sometimes there'll be an indirect object. I think the old man here is kind of an indirect object, and so you kind of put him to the side because he's modifying the object. And so, yeah, you could do this in English, you could do this in Greek. Now, when you got a text as big as Thomas's, I wouldn't do this. Because when you're dealing with 10 or 11 verses, it'll take you forever to do this. I would do the bracketing that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But when you have a shorter passage that's just a couple verses, this is a very good practice to do. Doesn't mean you're going to preach the details, but it means you understand the nuts and bolts of the text and how the author laid it out. Okay? And it really helps you not miss the point sometimes and some of the things that should be emphasized. I mean, for example, if you're preaching a sermon on this sentence, which I don't know why you ever would, but if you're spending 30 minutes talking about how sharp dogs' teeth are, you're missing the point. Okay? The point is an old guy got bit on the ankle, and you happened to see it. And if you were Thomas, you were laughing when you saw it, but pretty much that's the point that we're seeing here. Okay, so that's diagramming. Now, as we have our text picked, okay, we got the book picked, we got the text picked, and we're diagramming, we're doing all this studying. It is helpful if you know original languages. It's not necessary. My first 5 years as a pastor, I didn't know the original languages. I think I still did all right. I think I was faithful, okay? I wasn't disqualified because I didn't know the original languages, okay? But what I can say is I'm a better preacher now that I know them before I did. So it's helpful, but it's not necessary. Now, one day, Pastor John said he would love to teach Greek as one of these courses. I can tell you it doesn't matter who teaches it, it's hard. You just got to put in the work. But once it's there, you're good to go. Now, is there an advantage? Absolutely. Let me give one of these examples. Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, the Great Commission, right? Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you." Now, what preachers who don't know the original languages will do is they'll say, well, this text, I don't know why I always give them an accent, but they'll say, this text is clearly teaching you to do 4 things. There's 4 commands here. You need to go, you need to baptize, you need to teach them to obey. And go, baptize, preach, and teach them to obey, right? The text isn't commanding 4 things. If you look at it in the Greek, it's commanding 1 thing. See, you only have 1 verb. The verb is to make disciples, but there's 3 participles. And whenever you have a command verb, which is called an imperative, and then you have participles attached to it, those participles often tell you how to obey it. So the 1 command is make disciples, but how do you do it? With those 3 participles. As you go, preaching and teaching. That's how you make disciples. Okay? And then it's modified, teaching them to do what? To obey everything Jesus has commanded, right? So if somebody ever gets up there and says, this text has 4 truths for you, it doesn't. You could tell they haven't studied it in the original language. But if they say this has 1 core truth, we need to make disciples, and he tells us how to do it, now you're getting an expositional sermon, okay? And so that's one benefit. Now let me ask you something though. If a person said there's 4 things this is commanding us to do, go, teach, preach, and baptize, are they teaching heresy? No. Are you still going to get something good out of it? Are you going to go? Are you going to teach? Are you going to? Yeah. I'm just saying it failed to be well expositional, right? But again, end of the world is not there with that. I'm just trying to show you some of the benefit. Carlos?
So maybe as long as they're not saying these are the 4 steps that you have to engage to do evangelism, then that's when they're prescribing wrong.
Yeah, they're prescribing wrong, but it still wouldn't be heresy.
Right.
It would just be like, okay, you got the commands wrong. You got the application wrong. And again, knowing the languages helps to avoid that. But again, not 100% necessary. Okay? So that's just the caveat I'll give on that. And so whether you know the languages or not, what you want to do first is analyze the text. So you got your text picked. This is the first thing, analysis. Now, analysis just means to take a big thing, you break it up into its itty-bitty parts, you study those itty-bitty parts, okay, and then you put it back together and you kind of understand what you're dealing with. And a lot of times when you're reading the commentaries, they do a lot of that for you. So analysis. Let me just give you an order to it. It's right here on the slide. You start with the words themselves. What do the words mean? And I'm not telling you to look up every word. Well, what does and mean in Greek? No. Okay, it's going to be some of the significant words. Okay, what do the words mean? Start with words, and then next you move to syntax. And I'll tell you what syntax means in a minute. And then after syntax, you move to context. Okay, that's how you analyze the text. Words, syntax, context. Okay, so let's start with words. Word studies. This is the one thing that I see people do wrong probably more than anything else, okay? So word studies, you don't, as I said, have to do an in-depth study of each word, but certain words you probably want to know more about. So let's say you're preaching 1 Corinthians 1:27, where Paul says, God didn't choose you because you're wise. Okay, and instead he says God chose the weak. He chose the shameless, or the shame. He chose those of shame to shame those who think they're something. That's my paraphrase. But Paul keeps saying he chose, he chose, he chose. You might want to look that word up. Okay, and that word in the Greek is eklegomai. And so right here is a definition I took from the Lunaida dictionary, which is I think free in Logos, or it's been in every Logos package I've had. And, it tells you what it means, right? It's to make a special choice based on significant preference, often implying a strongly favorable attitude toward what is chosen. It kind of lets you know that there's nothing in that definition, well, it's to choose because you foreknow what they would do and found them to be lovely and therefore no. It's just, I like this, I'm choosing it. And that's how God elects us, right? Very important word to understand. So that's a simple Greek dictionary there. Very helpful. That's not a 10-page definition. And you could say, hey, this is what this word means. That way, you could cut off the alternative argument that people are going to make. Well, that's not what the word means. It means this, right? Now, if you know the Greek and Hebrew, the following dictionaries are good. You have the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament based on semantic domains. That's the dictionary I just showed that was in Logos. You have the New International Dictionary of the New Testament Theology and Exegesis. Let me show you that one. Show and tell, right? This baby. Okay, so this is pretty much every Greek word in the New Testament. That's why it's 5 volumes. And this baby is amazing. That's why I call her a baby. She's just an amazing text, amazing dictionary. Because what it does is it'll take the word, and first it'll tell you how this Greek word was used in classic literature throughout all of Greek-speaking history. Then it narrows it down and tells you this is how it was used in the Septuagint. And then narrows it down, this is how you see it used in the New Testament, and then it breaks it down by author. Because again, any given word has a wide range of meaning. This gives you it all. Right? And then you're able to kind of narrow it down. Well, this is what it tends to mean in the New Testament. This is how Paul tends to use it. I'm in a Pauline text. Boom. You're not going to go and take what Homer meant by it. Okay? And so, say again? How much was that? I don't remember. This one is owned by the church. I don't think I would have bought it with my own money. It was that much. But it's in my office. If any of you guys ever need it, just borrow it. Okay? The thing is, though, you have to at least know the Greek alphabet because the words aren't written in English. I mean, the information's in English, but to look up the word, you got to know your alphabet because you won't know where to look. So as long as you know the alphabet, you can make good use of this. But it's a great resource, and it helps you because sometimes preachers, you'll be reading a commentary, they'll be like, well, what this word meant when Homer used it, it was like the hooves of horses stabbing into the ground. But you got to say okay, because that's in Revelation, certain word, is John using this word like Homer did? Or is he using it like Moses did? And of course, Moses didn't speak Greek, but meaning is he using it like the Septuagint translators used it to translate what Moses wrote? Okay, those are important questions that you definitely want to know. You also have the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature. This is one I did buy. I know I think it was over $100, but it's a good one to have. Yeah, the BGAD. And so this thing, you throw this at someone, you're going to mess them up. But it's good. It's not going to give you like a 5 to 6 page full understanding, but it does a lot of what that other one does, just shorter. So this is a good one. I recommend it. And again, I have it. I'm pretty sure Brian has it. I think Pastor John has it. So if you need to borrow it from any of us, just let us know. We're not greedy with our books, especially with our elder interns. And then the Brown's Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon I have in my Logos. I don't have a physical copy of it, but that one's pretty old. But they haven't really made one that's current, and so hopefully they will. Now, if you don't know the Greek, then you could rely on Strong's Concordance. Just understand that people try to make too much out of the Strong's. They'll find the word, and then it's got all the definitions, and they will be like, well, you're clearly wrong because when I looked this up in Strong's, this is G2534. And what it clearly said, listen, what is in this is good, but it's not going to match what's in those other things, okay? So just keep that in mind. Another one is the Thayers, and you don't even have to get these ones in hard copy because they are usually free. I didn't pay for this. Somebody gave it to me. I wouldn't have paid for it because I got it for free digitally. But it looks cool to be able to hold it in your hand, right? So Thayer's also has some good definitions that will be helpful to you. So those are some of the things that are worth looking at. You know what? Funny thing is, I showed those things and I didn't even have the camera on. Strong's, Thayer's, and the BGAD. All right, so that's words. Once you feel like you got a grasp on the important words that you got to study, then you got syntax. Now, syntax itself it tells you what the words mean based on the other words that are around it. This is going to be the ultimate determiner of what the words mean because words by themselves mean very little. So comparing it to how it's being used in a sentence in relation to all these other words, that is syntax, and that's very important. It goes back to the diagramming we did. That diagramming that I showed you about the dog biting the old man's ankle, that's syntax, because you're comparing all the words to each other, okay? It shows how the word is functioning in the clause or the sentence, which lets you know what the precise meaning is. And it helps to avoid what D.A. Carson calls the totality transfer fallacy. Anybody know what that is, the totality transfer fallacy? Have you ever had somebody say, well, I looked up this particular Greek word in the Strong's Concordance, and it means 7 things. And so right here, when Jesus uses this word, first it means, and then they say the first one, and then second it means, and then third, and then they go all through all 7 and tell you every time you see this word, think of all of this. Well, that's not true, okay? Because if I said that, you know what, we had a gay time at Starbucks, you know, I know that's, yeah, but right? Are you going to say, well, what it meant is they were happy, and it also meant they were homos, you know, or whatever? No, you know that I'm meaning it specifically. You know I'm meaning it specifically as happy there. You know, and of course I'd say pick a different word in this current cultural context. That was the first one that came to mind, because that's one that has radically different meanings. Okay? Happy and homosexual don't mean the same thing. And so you would be able to tell by the context that you've got Christians who are happily married heterosexual men who are going to Starbucks to study the Bible. If they say they had a gay old time, they mean what the Flintstones meant in the song, that it was a happy, fun time together. It's not meaning the other thing, okay? And so syntax helps you. I've had one person say, no, very cocky person. He's like, no, all the meanings, you know, need to be taken into account in each one. And I'm like, no, the syntax determines which one. Every word's got a wide range. Syntax is going to help you narrow it down to which one's being used. It's that simple. Person had a story about how they died and went to heaven, and then every word that God said, all the definitions went through their mind at once, and so that convinced them when they came back to life. Again, I'm like, come on, that's not how this works. Syntax is the important part, okay? So, once you've got the syntax down and you've really so you've done the word studies, but also you're looking at how it's used in the sentence, you're good to go. Okay, syntax and word studies should not take too long unless you got a big text and there's some important theological words to it. But otherwise, this should be the easy part, okay? Now, context is where we spend most of the time. And you always hear us say context is king, or, if somebody misuses a verse, we always say, well, that, sir, is out of context, or whatever. Now, context, it's pretty big, okay? Context, there's a lot that goes into it. And so, there's a lot of different aspects of context that we need to talk about, okay? You have many different aspects of context that are necessary, and so the first one's historical context. When I say, oh, well, what is the historical context of your text? What I'm looking for, and what anybody's looking for, is everything that's beneath historical context in this bullet. What is the sweep of biblical history as it relates to your text? If you're in 1 John, we're getting near the end of the scriptural canon. So there's been a lot that God's revealed up to this point, and now we're getting near the end of the first century, so you kind of want to have that sweep of biblical history in your mind. Okay? We're not dealing with an old covenant text that's dealing with animal sacrifices and stuff like that. You also need to know your geography. Going to Israel helps. It's not necessary. Been able to do it for years without it. But man, there are certain pictures in my head now that help with it. Specific historical factors. For example, the Romans were the ones in charge during the New Testament. That's something you need to have in mind. It explains why they try to trap Jesus with the question of taxation. That wouldn't make sense if it was the book of Ezra, okay? But it makes sense in the Gospels. Cultural detail. You have to get into their world a little bit. You have to understand like what is normal for us and how we think and how we see things isn't necessarily the same for them, okay? So it's good to know those little cultural details, like how it was considered like shaming for an old man to gird up his loins and run, to show his old man legs, right? It's just that, but the prodigal son story, the father does that. Or Abraham, when he sees God come to his tent at the Oaks of Mamre, Abraham girds his loins and runs. He's almost 100 at that point. So knowing that they went outside of their norm and made a fool of themselves because of what was in front of them was far more important. Okay, that's a big deal. Okay, another example would be the woman at the well. Okay, why was she there in the heat of the day? You got to know the historical context. She obviously was a very immoral woman. Okay, and so she was shunned by the rest of the society. Yeah, you got that. And why did Jesus, when he started talking to her, why was she like, you're a Jew? You Jews say this, we say this. How are you, a Jew, talking to a Samaritan woman? All that stuff, if you don't understand the culture and what was going on, it's going to go over your head. As a preacher, you got to know that stuff so that you can make the text come alive to the people that you're preaching it to. Now, context continued. After you got the historical context and you know the world of the text, okay, then you have to have the textual context, okay? The textual context is first big picture. Where does this fit within progressive revelation? And you guys know what I mean by progressive revelation, right? That anybody not know?
I think I know what you're talking about. Like people believe that. Wait, say in the
So progressive revelation, it's the idea that God revealed the truth over the course of time. It progresses. So Abraham knew less than you know about the gospel because he only had the little seeds of the promise. Moses knew more than Abraham. David knew more than Moses. And by the time you get to the apostles, they knew more than them all because God keeps giving us more. It's progressive. So if you're talking about the full-on resurrection of the dead in Job, then you're reading something far later into Job that Job wouldn't have known, okay? And so I give that as an example. Actually, I give that as an example on the next slide, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. Oh, no, I give it as an example here. So Job had some idea of the resurrection, okay? He has some idea of it. He says, like, my Redeemer lives, I'll see him with my eyes, Job 19, 26 through 27. But we can't say that he fully understood, like, we're going to have these indestructible resurrection spiritual bodies that Paul gives us the details about in 1 Corinthians 15. Both show the resurrection, but revelation progresses. By the time you get to Paul, he knew a lot more about what the resurrection was going to be like than Job. Now, is it okay when you're preaching Job to mention what Paul later says? Yes, Just don't present it as if Job knew that, if that makes sense. Carlos?
That's what I was going to ask, because it's one thing to say that the particular author or writer, like say Job, knew something, but it could be that they uttered things that they didn't know, in the same way that the high priest utters things that they don't know, but yet they don't know it, but yet it's still relating to something that is known.
Absolutely.
Not by them necessarily.
Absolutely, and sometimes what they utter becomes the seed that then grows into a bigger plant throughout progressive revelation. Because revelation's progressive, that's why typology is a thing. And so that's a good point that you make. And yeah, sometimes they do speak beyond what they know. And so that's the context of progressive revelation. Where does this book fit in the whole thing? So if Thomas is preaching from Luke, where it fits is this is the third gospel in the canon. Old Testament's closed. We are now in the New Testament and the New Covenant, and we're seeing what Jesus taught, right? And how it's all like all the Old Testament is being fulfilled in Him, right? That's the progressive revelation point of it. But at that point, they don't know about baptism in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Not in Luke chapter 14. Okay, that hasn't been revealed yet. So knowing what has been revealed and what hasn't is important. Now, once you got the textual context within the whole Bible, now you have to have the context within that specific book. So for example, sometimes people will give you a quote from Job as if it's like they're correcting you on something. Look closely, because if his friends said it, the book of Job disputes his friends' theology. They, by and large, got it wrong. And so you don't get your theology from Job's friends. The book's correcting their bad theology. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And also, we know that like when you're arguing with somebody who's not sound, they're going to pluck a verse out of context. And usually what you do is you just go and read that whole chapter and you say, hey, that's not even what this is talking about. What it's talking about is this. Like, this isn't even a biblical book, but if you remember when we were arguing with that black Hebrew Israelite, and he tried to open up the book of Tobit from the Apocrypha and said they will cross westward across the water. And they're like, see, who was taken westward across an ocean in boats? And then you read very closely, and the next verse says it's the Euphrates River. And they're like, of course, the Jews were exiled to Babylon. To get back to Israel, they have to cross the Euphrates. I'm like, come on, man, you don't even know what you're talking about. We're talking about a river, not an ocean. Well, no, it means an ocean. It just said the name of the river, right? And so the context, the context within that specific book is very, very important. In Ephesians 2, where Carlos is going to be going. Much of the first chapter was a barakah, a rabbinical blessing that Paul's giving. Blessed be the Lord our God. And then he gives all the reasons why he's blessed, all the awesome things God has done. And then, of course, near the end of the chapter, he then says, and look, this is how it affects you guys. You're in the heavenlies with them. But then when he gets to chapter 2, he's like, let's consider where we were. We were dead in our trespasses, but God made us alive. And listen, it's not by works, it's by faith. And then the next thing that comes after that is, well, what about Israel? What about the Gentiles? How does this all work? And then he gets into that, right? So all that stuff is very, very important. Okay, so that's the specific context of the book. Now, moving on, there's then the literary context. So you got historical context, know their world, textual context, where does it fit in the whole Bible? Where does it fit within that particular book? Okay, and then you got the literary context. Are we dealing with figurative or are we dealing with literal? Let me give you an example. Near the end of the book of John, it says that Jesus, when Jesus told them to catch some fish and they counted it, it said it was 153 fish, if I remember. Now, is that meant to be taken metaphorical? No, it's in a historical narrative. You were meant to understand that they caught exactly 153 fish. Okay, that's how many they caught. But when you look at something like Psalms, where God says, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Only 1,000? Once you get past 1,000, God doesn't own it. Obviously, that's being figurative. Say again? You only own cattle. Yeah, you only own cattle. You don't own the stars. Oh, I knew you were weak. No, I mean, obviously, what God is saying is everything is mine. But he's using the phrase 1,000 cattle on 1,000 hills. So you have to know what kind of text you're in, the literary context. Okay, so for example, is it history? Is it epistle? Is it gospel? Is it apocalyptic? Is it wisdom? Is it poetry? Is it prophecy? And some books have more than one kind, like Revelation. People be like, well, that's apocalyptic. It is. But John also identifies it as prophetic. And he starts it off as a letter, as an epistle. So when you're reading Revelation, you got to be looking for epistle, prophecy, and apocalyptic all rolled in one. That's one reason that book is so hard for people to preach at times. And so then once you've got the context down, okay, you're like, I understand this now. I know what the words mean. I pretty much, I know the syntax. I've got the context, historical, biblical, and textual. Okay, I got all that. Now let me start examining the structure of the text. And this is what I would do with bigger texts, is find out the macro structure, the big picture structure, through bracketing, which I'll show you on the next slide. Now, again, if you could do it in the original languages, that's good, but you don't need to. When I learned how to do it in Tom Schreiner's New Testament studies class, we did it in English. Okay, it was only later, once I got the grasp of it, that I said, you know what, I'm going to do this in Greek too. But this is what it looks like. This is my most recent sermon. Wow, well, you could barely see that. So never mind. This bulb is failing. But this is the Beatitudes. I wish I could show you better. Now maybe on the video it's showing up good, but maybe not. But pretty much, does it look better there?
You turn the lights on.
Yeah, I could do that. Let me see what happens.
It's like
Yeah, it's still not showing you what's to the left.
the words are really small.
I guess that's my fault for taking a 12-verse text to do that. But pretty much what I do, you'll see it in a video. I got a 7-minute video at the end that I want to show. But pretty much what I do is I take each verse and I slice it up into verbal clauses. A clause that has a verbal thought, subject, verb, possible object. Cut those up, and then I show how they relate to each other. Are they a series? Is it a progression? Is it a negative positive? Is it an if-then? Is it a grounding statement? Like a grounding statement would tell you why. Okay, so for example, in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, that's the statement, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. That's a grounding statement. Is it an inference? An inference is where it tells you to do something. So for example, Romans chapter 12 starts with the word therefore. That means it's an inference from everything else that was said. In light of all this, therefore, do this, right? And so I do suggest people get Bible Arc. It takes a while to learn it. Okay, I remember when I first started, it was like 2 hours every time for a verse, sometimes 3. Now, with the Greek, it could be this long. I'm usually 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. And so that's why I keep telling John, because he's just starting to learn it. I'm like, don't give up on it. Like all skills, it's hard at first, but once you get it, it's fast, it's second nature. This is how, like, if you ever want to know how like in my sermon, I say, and the author shows this with 4 whatever, or 2 whatever, it's because of this. I'm able to figure out through the structural analysis how many sub-points the author's using to make the main point. So remember how I said you have to, on this side, understand the author's, or the text's structure? That way you could then later write the sermon structure. The sermon structure has to match the text structure. What I notice is when people don't do something like this, it doesn't necessarily have to be this, but if they don't do something like this, then they fail to get the structure. And so then their sermon might say good things, but it's not even following the text structure. And sometimes the people in the audience are lost. Like we were here, he talked for a long time on this first thing. We went real fast over all this middle stuff. Now he's talking a long time on this. It's because the structure just wasn't there. So this helps you with that. Now, after structural analysis, you're going to do thematic analysis. Thematic analysis pretty much is like, okay, how is the author stringing things together? Typically, authors only take one topic at a time. So if we're dealing with what David's going to be preaching, John is taking the topic of how loving Christ interacts and intersects with loving each other. And you can't separate them. That's what John's talking about at that point. He's not talking about necessarily the heretics at that point. He will, okay? But he's talking about like how you know somebody's really a Christian. How do you discern movement to a new topic? Sometimes it's easier than others. But there's usually going to be conventions within the composition itself. Like he'll say therefore or wherefore, or you might have repetition or variation. I've told you with Matthew, he has Jesus teach a big block and then shows Jesus do a bunch of stuff. And then there'll be an inclusio that lets you know he's moving on, right? That's one way that I know, and that's what helps me see these 5 blocks. And I'm not going to lie and say I figured that out all by myself. No, commentaries point that out. And then once they point it out, you're like, oh, now I see it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So those are things that help. Chiasms help. Or for example, when you know you're moving to a new little chunk in Hebrews 11, you just look for the word by faith. By faith, he's now starting a new person. Okay, by faith, Noah. And then he'll blah, 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 blah. By faith, Abraham. Blah, 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 blah. By faith, Sarah. So that'll let you know that he's moving to the next one. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about before I show that video is commentaries. They are very helpful in putting a lot of this together for us. Often they do focus on the meaning of the text. They do focus on individual words. Just be careful. Recently for a text, the poor in spirit, I was reading John MacArthur's commentary, which isn't an exegetical commentary. It's an expositional commentary, still good. But his word study on what poor meant, he's like, this is the dirtiest of the dirt poor. There's 7 New Testament words for poor, and this is the worst. I then took it to that big 5-volume one, which had like 6 pages on it, and that wasn't found anywhere in it. And keep in mind, they're taking this word from Classic Greek, Septuagint, and New Testament, and that wasn't anywhere there. So obviously I didn't get up there and repeat what was in MacArthur's commentary because it was not verified by some of the more academic research. Now everything else in his chapter was very good, very helpful, very useful, but that one. So what I'm saying is don't always take what the commentaries say. Always check them. That's why you read more than one. But for the most part, they will do the word studies. A lot of times...
Like not being isolated as a Christian.
Yes.
In context with studying the word. See what other commentators...
Yes, sometimes people will only read one. I only read this guy. Well, you're now stuck. You want to read at least a couple, okay? And so the commentaries, they'll tell you what these words mean in the context. They'll help you with the syntax. They'll help you with the contextual analysis. They'll tell you what the historical context is and how this worked in that culture. They do a lot of the work for you, but the reason why I tell you do as much as you can first is so that you're not a slave to the commentary. I know some people who cannot preach a text without a commentary. Okay, and here's the thing. When we were in Israel, there were a lot of times where I was called on last minute. Could you give a teaching on Megiddo from the mountaintop of Megiddo? I didn't have my commentaries with me, so I'm like, all right, let me start flipping through my Bible. And then, I was able to give a 5 to 10 minute little sermonette on that. And it ended up being accurate, and it's the stuff you'll find in the commentaries, okay? So you want to learn to do this kind of studying on your own. That way, when you read the commentaries, it's just adding stuff you didn't know. And sometimes when the commentaries disagree with each other, you're like, man, I don't know which one to believe on this. Well, when you've done the work yourself, you're kind of like, hey, I'm going with this guy. I'm going with this guy on it because his arguments make more sense. Now, again, not all commentaries are equal. Exegetical commentaries are far more detailed. It helps if you know the Greek. You don't need to know the Greek, but it helps to read them. If you don't know the languages, then regular commentaries are good. So here's a picture of some of the exegetical ones. And then, so you got the Baker, you got the NIGTC, you got the Pillar commentary set. And then, of course, you got... these are the more expositional ones. You have the MacArthur study. You got the New Testament commentary, which is Presbyterian. You got the expositor's commentary. These are all good. So again, a lot of that should help you understand specifically this left side. And again, we got more to say when it comes to hermeneutics. We got more to say when it comes to hermeneutics on this stuff, and so we'll hit that next time. The last thing I want to say today has to deal with what I call the ladder of abstraction, okay? When it comes to preaching, some of the concepts that you're preaching are going to be abstract from the text, and you have to climb up the ladder of abstraction to make it less abstract. And what I mean by that, okay, if you look at this, if you take love your enemies as you love yourself, there's no abstraction there. What it meant 2,000 years ago is what it means today. But if I were to say, don't cook a baby goat in its mother's milk, and you're trying to preach that today, now there's this abstraction because a modern audience is like, who would cook a baby goat in its mother's milk? And why is that sentence in the Bible? What does it even mean? And so to climb that ladder of abstraction, you have to explain, okay, what this was is this was a Canaanite pagan practice where they worshiped their gods with cruelty by taking a baby just born and then cooking it right in front of its mother in its own mother's milk, trying to get the favor from their cruel gods. And what God is telling Israel is, I don't want you to do anything like that. Now, what that means for us today is stay away from paganism, period. Where you're going to see paganism in our day, maybe yoga, maybe this or that, but stay away from it. That's how you climb the ladder of abstraction. It's easy when you got love your neighbors, you love yourself because you don't got to do any climbing. But occasionally you get those passages, like why did God tell them to wipe out all the Canaanites? You got to climb that ladder of abstraction and show what the timeless truth is for all of us, okay? And so, not always easy, but always necessary. Okay, now by the time you are done with all of this, you should have solved the question of what the text meant. Now you want to move into what the text means. Okay, and in other words, you extract from the text's original contextual meaning the timeless meaning that applies to all of us, and then you start moving into the writing of the sermon. Thomas?
You got 2 minutes.
Okay, so I got 2 minutes till 9:30. 9:30 was, I said my hard stop, but I got them to give me till 9:45. I am done. I'm going to show a video. It's a 7-minute cruddy video I made before, it was just with the cell phone, before I got like microphones that make it better, so please be nice. But it'll in 7 minutes show you this process. And you could tell I was still a high school teacher at the time. Hi, I'm Pastor Stephen Feinstein. I want to make a short video for you guys to show you just how much work goes into sermon preparation for pastors who actually do expositional preaching. Not all preaching is the same, and it's definitely not all equal. Many pastors just do topical preaching Sunday after Sunday, where they come up with an idea and then they sprinkle Bible verses on top. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is when a pastor goes to the Word of God and preaches a full text, and that the point of the text that they're preaching is the point of the sermon. Now, if a pastor is going to do that, which they should do that, a lot of work goes into it. And I want the people of the church to know just how much study goes in to making such sermons. And so bear with me as I just show you really briefly how much goes into it. So first we start with the Greek text, and so I'm just scrolling to show you how it's all broken up and put apart. And then I start translating it. So the Greek is peride ton parthenon, which would be but concerning virgins. And then epitagain kurio uk echo, I have no command from the Lord. And then what I do here is I always stop at the verbs, because the verbs are the main movers of any sentence. And so the verb here is echo, which is I have. And what I always do is I, on the side, will tell you what the verb is. I'm mainly doing this for my own self, but it's a verb. It's in the present tense. It's active in its voice. It's indicative in its mood, meaning it indicates something. And it's first person singular. So this is the completed translation. It took me a good 2.5 to 3 hours to get this done, just because this text is a lot longer than they normally are. And then of course you could see on the side all the verbs parsed. After I'm done with the Greek text, then the next thing I want to do is I want to figure out what the exact relationship is between all the clauses. So what I do is I have the ESV translation on the left, and then I have my own translation on the right, and I use a program called BibleArc. And what I'm doing here is I'm breaking the verses up into their individual propositions, which is pretty much it's a complete thought, a subject, verb, an object. And so I break it up into all of its individual propositions, and then what I'm going to do is determine the relationship between them so that I can understand the flow of the text and the argument of the author. So after it's all done and I have it split into all of its many propositions, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start making the brackets. The brackets describe the relationship from proposition to proposition. So you always start with the smallest thought, and then you move to the bigger one. So right here I have one clause or one proposition. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. That bracketing relationship is called question and answer, and that's why you see Q&A. And then the same thing is true of do not are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So those are both question and answers. But now how are these two questions of answers related to each other? They're a series. And so that's why I put S for a series there. But then beyond that, I need to connect it to an even bigger thought. So how does it connect to the proposition prior to it, where it says it's good for a person to remain as he is? Well, here, this is an idea explanation. The idea is it's good for a person to remain as he is, and then this series is an explanation of that. Well, like the translation process goes, this is very time-intensive and laborious, but when it's all done, you can now see the entire text and all of its clauses related to each other, both in the small picture and the big picture. So the idea with this is to show the relationship between the clauses. So first we start with the clauses right next to each other, or the propositions. But then we move out and we start showing the connection between bigger chunks. And so that's what I show there. And then finally, as you go further and further to the left, these brackets are showing the relationship between the major sections, not just propositions, but sections. And then finally, you end up with the general idea of what is the main thrust or point or argument that all these are making collectively. Once you've done your Greek translation and your bracketing, you're now ready to move to the commentaries. These are some of the bigger commentaries that I like to use. As far as the commentaries go, for the New Testament, the New International Greek Testament Commentary is probably one of the heftier ones. Very technical, dry reading, it takes a long time to get through it. Not as intense as the other one, but the Baker series is also a really good exegetical commentary, filled with a lot of great historical information and grammatical insight. And I can't forget about my trusty Bible software program known as Logos. This has thousands upon thousands of resources in it and very helpful tools. Right here on the right side, I'm just looking through some commentaries. So in addition to reading hardback commentaries, I also read digital ones. I would say to prepare for a sermon, I probably read between 70 to 100 pages of commentary total to get the historical background, and believe me, it's not fast reading. In addition to commentaries, this program also has many other tools, like this right here shows you Greek words and their relationships within the sentences. Very helpful. And when you are done looking at the commentaries, then you could consult your systematic and historical theologies.
So with this video, I just showed you in a very fast way all of the research that goes into putting together a good sermon.
I'll just stop that. I'll stop that there. And so, yeah, let me stop that there real quick. And so what I want to end with just real quick is what I would like you guys to do for next week, or yeah, the next week when we come together, is with your text, if you can, and please try, do the word study, look at the syntax, historical, textual, context, just have the context down. If you have time to do some sort of structural analysis, do so. If you don't know how to, skip that one, but really be like thinking how you could how the text breaks up into subparts though. So like if is Paul or whoever making a couple points here, is he talking about a couple different things? At least figure out where you divide those, okay? And then how they all relate to each other. And so next week, what I'd like you to do is just tell me a little bit of what you learned about your text and how you understand the structure. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move into the hermeneutics. And so with that, we are done. And so thank you very much for coming to this course. All right.